All right, let's get started. Just a note about the last exam, in large part because one of my goals always is that you will become better students, because I don't know what your experience is in K-12, but way too many people sort of answer things based on what they already think they know, which usually isn't much, or they guess, or they find BS on the internet. So last week's lecture, which some of you were here for, I said point blank, here's what I said. Government intervenes in the economy via fiscal policy, monetary policy, and regulation. And probably 2/3 to 3/4 of the class, all they said was regulation. I don't really know how I could have made that more clear. So this week, I hope once again that people will pay a little more attention and maybe even do the reading, because there's stuff that we're going to talk about that it's easy to get wrong, and it's just as easy to get it right. So anyway, there's that. Now let's take a look here. We're talking about international relations on the same general subject. This week's discussion question is about trade. That reading is in the three problems chapter. And one of the points I want to make is that you sort of have to actually know what that is, because obviously there will be exam questions, and I will not once again be terribly forgiving if what you say has nothing to do with actual trade. So here we go, international relations. The best way to describe the world is anarchy. And the reason we say that is because if we look at the world, there is no one government in charge. It certainly isn't the United Nations. It's no particular country. Some countries obviously have more influence than others because they're large and powerful in various ways. So, and what's really unlikely, this is something that gets some fanatics knickers in a twist, is, oh, this world government, that's not going to happen. At present, it would simply be too difficult for any one government to run such a diverse world. It would fall apart. So that won't happen. Don't let that keep you up at night. Here's an important concept. This is on the damn test, so write this down, okay? Sovereignty. Sovereignty means that a country has defined borders and is the ultimate authority within those borders. If you don't have that, you're not a country. And I'll tell you this, just because you're here, there's a multiple choice question, and one of the choices is, has a flag and an Olympic team. And people choose that as the thing that defines sovereignty. And it's like, no, that doesn't matter at all. It's those two things that I just mentioned. There are something on the order of 195 actual countries in the world. There are a number of territories, things that sort of function like countries but aren't. And then a number of places that would like to be countries but aren't. There's always somewhere between a half a dozen or a dozen of those. So, and any number of places that really actually probably would make countries. So one of those examples would be Kurdistan. There's 50 million Kurds in the Middle East. It's the largest ethnic group without its own country, which goes back to the Europeans carving up chunks of the world and sort of leaving some people in and leaving some people out, with fairly horrific consequences over the years, people killing each other simply because they're different, crazy stuff. But in any case, there are Kurds in Turkey and Iraq and Iran. From a foreign policy standpoint, the United States, most recently President Trump, the Kurds have been our loyal allies over and over and over again, and frankly, we just keep jobbing them. It's appalling. It's simply appalling. Anyway, so here's an example of a place. There is a country called Somalia. Some of you may be familiar with this, all right? And Somalia was carved together from different groups. Parts of it were an Italian protectorate. Parts of it were a British protectorate when the British were ripping and the Europeans were ripping off vast chunks of Africa. So it's a country, but there's the South, where the government in Mogadishu has really limited authority, and they're constantly fighting against Islamic militants and pirates and whatnot. So that's really Somalia proper, and it doesn't work all that well. Now, the other two parts of Somalia, you see to the north there is Puntland, and to the far sort of northwest is Somaliland. Puntland doesn't really want to be a country, but it functions like one. It's much more calm and stable than Somalia to the south. And Somaliland up north there wants to be a country and functions as a country, has defined borders. They have a government. Their government, to some extent, is based on tribal relations and tribal elders and people sorting things out. And by all accounts, it works pretty well. So both of those places are okay. Only about 2 countries in the world actually recognize Somaliland as a country. So even though it functions as one, it isn't really. And there are a number of places like that around the world that want to be their own countries. But you have to have somebody, if other countries don't recognize it, then it doesn't count. So now here's a couple of terms we should understand. There are questions on this. A nation is a group of people united by a common cultural, linguistic, or ethnic similarities, right? So the Kurds are a nation in much the way that, some people say Red Sox nation, all the people who are fans of the Boston Red Sox. So it's not necessarily a country. Not every state is a nation, because many countries are, in fact, ethnically and linguistically diverse. I mean, if anything unites the United States, and I still think to some extent this is true, it's our ideology. It's not where our ancestors were from, and increasingly it's not even what language that we speak. So, Switzerland, for example, small country in the middle of Europe, well, they have French people, and they have Italian people, and they have German people. So that's a country, but not a nation. A nation state is both a nation and a sovereign country. And there are very few of those that are sort of ethnically or linguistically homogenous. So we might say that about Israel, but most other countries in the world have more diversity than we might suspect. So Japan is a little bit like a nation state, although they have a big Korean minority there. So there are several approaches to international relations, and the in some ways the first and the biggest one is called liberalism. I'm going to ask you to talk about liberalism. And if you start writing about classical liberalism and writing about how it's about markets and people having elections, you will get a 0, because that's not what this means. So please, for the love of God, write this down, okay? Liberalism in an international relations sense says that countries don't have to focus on war, and they should seek to use diplomacy, international institutions, and commerce, trade, as ways of building relationships with other states. Just look, most people don't want to go to war all the time. We can have safe and productive international relations if we just focus on the other stuff. And there's some truth to this. Aside from Russia, and aside from the Balkans in the 80s and 90s, Europe hasn't had a real war since the Second World War. So 70 years, they've gone without a war, and they used to fight all the time. And the reasons for that are, well, they're all connected at the wallet, right? They have the European Union, They have open borders, they have trade. So even though you have all these different countries and they're all really quite different in many ways, it's not really the United States of Europe. Still, nobody thinks about going to war against each other because they have other ways of solving disputes. So to some extent, this works. And this is true of every idea we're going to talk about here. There's some truth to all of them. So the thought was that democratic states were much less likely to go to war, and except for the United States, that's probably true. And I think, you may disagree, we've been involved in some wars of late we have no business in, and I'm not talking about the Ukraine. So this is referred to as the Kantian triangle. Immanuel Kant was a philosopher a few hundred years ago, and he said, look, if we want peace, we've got to practice these things, right? So democratic states are less likely to make war. International organizations give us an opportunity to talk things out instead of just shooting at each other. And economic interdependence means that war is less likely simply because everybody's making too much money. So if we go back to World War I and World War II, this is true. There was a British guy who wrote this book in 1912 saying Europe wouldn't go to war, and these were the reasons he sort of gave. He ended up being wrong, but in both cases, the war was started by Germany, and Germany at that point was not a democratic state. You know, I've been to 60 different countries, and I tell you, most people don't wake up in the morning thinking, which foreigners can we kill today? And that's true in every place that I've been, and that includes China and the Middle East and a number of places in between. So this is one approach to international relations. The caution here has to be, obviously, that not every state is democratic. And, you know, in a non-democratic state, you can get somebody who's basically batshit crazy in charge and decides we're going to war. So that happens. And this leads to the other sort of major approach to international relations, which is realism. And realism says that you should be militarily and economically strong because the world is a dangerous place and you should prepare for the worst. So this was sort of when George W. Bush was president, we were engaged in this kind of foreign policy to some extent. That's how we ended up in Iraq and Afghanistan, because they thought, yeah, we're going to take care of this ahead of time. I don't think you could argue that it worked out. So, so realism sort of tempers the optimism of liberalism. Now, the third approach, constructivism, and constructivism, as is explained in the reading, it really says, look, people can make choices. And that we may be blinding ourselves to other foreign policy options if we think that all we can do is go to war. It doesn't really tell us what to do, but it does tell us that we could do something different. And indeed, this has some truth to it too. I mean, the United States and the Soviet Union could have had a nuclear war, the Cuban Missile Crisis in the early 1960s. And I have to tell you, this was for reals. I was, 6 years old, and I remember in grade school, we had a drill where we all got under our desks. And I later figured out they didn't tell us why. They just said, we're going to do this. And we did that. We got under our desks. Drill was over. We got back up. Wasn't about earthquakes. That was a bomb drill. And you know, it was kind of a frightening time. But in the end, both with the Cuban Missile Crisis and then eventually with the collapse of the Soviet Union, leaders made different choices. And they weren't choices that were dictated by anything other than, you know, we need to do something different, beginning with survival. So constructivism says you could think your way out of this. Now, neo-Marxism is kind of interesting. we kind of dismiss Karl Marx because look, I mean, that's a statue representation, but in every picture I've ever seen, as one author noted, no one knows if Marx even had a neck because this beard covered everything. Neo-Marxist theory argues that productive relations, capitalism, causes states to compete with each other for scarce resources, and they oppress workers in the process. And as always, there's some truth to that. China is making contracts with countries in Africa that have natural resources that they want to make sure that they have. And I don't gather it's necessarily particularly good for the people who are there, because Chinese don't exactly have sort of a great record on labor relations. So they have unions in China, for example, but they're all government approved, which means they're window dressing. They're like non-democratic legislatures. So there's some truth to this. It's something to keep in mind if you're looking at how states interact. You find that. Now, this one is also pretty interesting. Feminism, feminist theory, when it comes to international relations, says, look, one, women's contribution and participation in world history is generally overlooked, and I think that's true. We certainly saw that when we talked about political theory. After Plato, it took all the way into the late 19th century before anybody even started talking about women in politics again, other than the brave women who fought to get the right to vote in this and other countries. And it argues that, you have to look not just at the historical role, but the potential role women can play in foreign policy. So we don't find many examples in history of states ruled by women that consequently went to war. There are a few. Catherine the Great in Russia greatly expanded the Russian Empire by force. Margaret Thatcher was, a prime minister of the United Kingdom for a while, and she was warlike, to put it mildly. But then again, she didn't invade any place. She just directed the British military to reclaim the Falklands from Argentina. So, and the few other examples involve women who were queens who went to war basically to defend their homelands. So women, for whatever reason, seem less likely to start wars. So we should not dismiss. I wouldn't dismiss any of these. These theories all tell us something about how the world works and how we might view the way states get along or don't get along with each other. So all very important. Now, really, what is it that we're going to understand about liberalism? Because my head will explode if I have to grade another essay that says it's about voting and markets. That ain't what we're talking about, right? So what is liberalism in international relations? Put it in the chat field or say something. This is where a live class is better because I can just call on you. If you don't know, you're going to suck at this question. Be brave. It's better to get it wrong now than when you're answering the question. Natalie? You'll have to unmute yourself if you're trying to answer. No? Very good, Sky. Everybody see that in the chat field? So liberalism has something in common with classical liberalism, and it kind of builds out of that tradition. It's just not exactly the same thing. You could have a truly democratic socialist state that would probably function the same way. I'm not advocating that. That's one of those terms that gets kicked around by people. It just drives me nuts. When Bernie Sanders was running for president, he attempted to paint himself and his many fans. It's democratic socialism, which has an actual meaning, and Bernie Sanders, oh, sorry, Natalie. Bernie Sanders is a socialist, right? And socialists believe that the government should have a much higher level of involvement in the economy, basically nationalizing important industries. Democratic socialism, what that really means is it refers to political parties in Europe that were socialist, but they called themselves democratic socialists because they weren't Marxist. They did not believe in a one-party state. They thought you should still have elections, right? People should still get to vote, and their choices should matter. So the reason I think that Bernie Sanders called himself a democratic socialist was that I think he understood if you're a real socialist at present, you can't get elected in America, and you certainly can't get elected president. And so many people I know and friends of mine were very excited about Bernie and very frustrated that he didn't get the nomination. But the bottom line is he never got enough votes. I mean, his thought both times he ran was that he would get this outpouring of young voters and they would push him over the top. But as we know, young people are less likely to vote than any group of people, and it just didn't happen. Anyway, so there's that. So if you see Sky's answer there, that's really what we're talking about. Now, as I said, it's true of all of these things. Sometimes they work, right? And there's certainly some truth to that. If all of the states in the world were truly democratic, we'd probably have a lot less war. Now, here's a question for you. And I don't know that this comes up in the exam, but I really think this is worth understanding because some other people have some other theories that aren't borne out by anything like evidence. So what we're talking about here is trying to figure out why is a state democratic or not? The answer to this is, I'll put this in the chat field. Development theory. And what development theory suggests is that if a country's average wealth becomes high enough, people then feel like they have a stake in the system, and the government will, sort of by popular demand, become more democratic. And the best example we have of this is Mexico. Now, our neighbor to the south, as you know, you may recall, has a democratic government, right? They have states, they have a congressional system of government. They have an elected president, they have an elected Congress, they have states. It's federalism like we have. It's not strong federalism. The Mexican states have sort of less power than US states and even less power than Canadian provinces. But the thing of it is that they have real elections now. So from the 20s to the 70s, Mexican politics was dominated by one party, the PRI, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, which is something of a contradiction in terms, but in any case, Mexico was not then a very wealthy country, and its economy was sort of overly managed by the state, and wealth did not get dispersed. So you had a big division in rich and poor. And then beginning in the 70s, Mexico began to liberalize its economy. It produced oil, which made it wealthier, but just got wealthier overall. Got a much bigger middle class, and their politics were transformed. So in the 80s, for the first time in half a century, somebody who didn't represent the PRI got elected president, and now they have competitive elections. So if you have a high enough average standard of living, you are much more likely to be a democratic state. If nothing else, if people are comfortable, everybody calms the heck down. They start voting, they start paying attention. We see that in our own communities, right? If we have communities where people are more poor, they are less likely to vote. In communities that are wealthier, people are more likely to vote. Things just tend to work better. So Seems to me the answer probably is try to make more people more wealthy and you get a better society. But and this gets to something about trade that we will talk a little bit about next week. But as long as we're on this subject, you should understand NAFTA, because this will come up again. NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement, and it tries to provide free trade between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And it started like this. So as Mexico became wealthier and their government became sort of smarter and more observant as a result, they realized that 2/3 of their economy was basically doing business with the United States. And they said, wow, if anything were to interrupt that, we're screwed, right? We're in deep trouble. So Mexico came to the United States in the late 80s and early 90s and said, we should formalize this arrangement. And the United States at the time said, yeah, good idea. Let's bring in Canada while we're at it. So there's some Canadian-Mexican trade, but Canada's one of our biggest trading partners. Mexico's an important market and supplier. And, if they're doing better, we're going to do better. So we sat down and hammered out this trade deal. Now, what people said at the time, as always with these kinds of things, some people said this was going to make the economy just boom. And other people said there will be, horrible consequences, that businesses will flee the United States to get cheaper labor in Mexico. And the gains were not anywhere near what was promised, but neither were the losses. The net effect was, the first thing to understand about this, so a tariff, right? Got to know about tariffs, because this will come up again. Tariffs are a tax on imports. And historically, countries have used tariffs to discourage imports and boost their own domestic industries for all the reasons that we have considered, I think, already. You've got more jobs, people have more money, everything works better. So they're trying to preserve jobs at home by making imports more expensive. The tariff on goods coming from Mexico before NAFTA was about 3%. A 3% tax on imports was not stopping anybody from moving a factory to Mexico. That's the bottom line. So some companies have moved stuff to Mexico and some haven't. And, it is what it is. President Trump renegotiated NAFTA. I'm not sure if it made any difference. It's not a bad trade relationship as they go. And of course, we'll talk more about trade next week. But free trade basically means trade without barriers. So no tariffs, no quotas. Quotas are a limit on the number of units that can be imported. Right? So if you put a quota on goods, you can't move them there. Countries attempt to protect their domestic industries one way or another. Okay? And they might put in quotas, they might put on tariffs, and they might have sort of overzealous health and safety regulations. So for a long time, for example, Japan tried to limit imports of US automobiles to Japan, because that's a big industry there still, by really, really precise regulations, which didn't have anything to do with safety. Now, on the other hand, they probably didn't need to do anything because American automobile manufacturers declined to make a product for the Japanese auto market that had the steering wheel on the left side, where it is on all cars produced in Japan. I mean, you can imagine how many Japanese cars they'd sell if they made cars for the US market that had the steering wheel on the wrong side. And having driven in England, I can tell you, if the steering wheel's on the other side, that's a little bit of a challenge. It's tricky. It's tricky. So The Great Depression gave tariffs a bad name. So after World War II, countries of the world attempted to sort of enforce free trade. I think in some ways that's too bad, not because I'm anti-trade. Trade produces neither all of the gains nor all of the problems that its supporters and opponents declare, but a small tariff would raise money. It would not penalize inefficient producers, and you could use that money to help people who are affected negatively by trade. The challenge now is if you start putting tariffs on goods, everybody else responds. And then all of a sudden, everything is more expensive. So it would be trickier. It would take great diplomatic skills to say, here's what we're going to do, and you can do the same thing, and we're all good with that. If you just did that, it's going to cause trouble. All right. Questions about anything? We're almost done. You're going to pass. You're going to do fine. Like I said, my goal is that you will come away from this being slightly better students, because the whole point of an undergraduate degree is to learn how to learn. Because, you know, unless you become a poli-sci major, what are you going to remember from this? 10 or 15%, some useful stuff, you know, something about voting. You have a little better idea of how governments work. But things we might take away, you really got to take notes when you read, and you really got to pay attention. You got to stay focused. Granted, that would be easier if we were together live in a class. I could see you nodding off. I'd make your seatmate poke you. But college, you have to make it a priority. You have to keep showing up. You will have classes you like and classes you don't like. It doesn't matter. You just have to get through them. And in the end, you get a degree, and you learn how to learn, and that's a skill you can take with you anywhere. And many of you will decide to go to graduate school, and then you'll learn even more about what it is that you really want to do. And it's never too late. My aunt, she had a family. She got a bachelor's degree at 40. She got a master's degree at 50, and she taught college for 20 years after that. So students say, oh, I'm getting so old. No, you're not. You can always go back to school, learn something new, try something. Most of us will have in our lifetime multiple careers. If you know how to learn, that task is much, much easier. All right. No questions today? Anything you want me to go over again? You've got really sort of two chapters to read left. You've got the international relations chapter, and that's pretty straightforward. Stuff that we've just gone over, but in greater detail. And then the three problems chapter talks about trade and deficits, and it talks about water. Water is a serious issue. And it talks about climate change, which is somewhat related to the water problem. So, for example, like it says in the chapter, fresh water is in short supply. You know, we've got all these oceans, and if your community is near the ocean, as some have done, you can build desalination plants and make fresh water from salt water. Well, they're expensive, and if you're not on the coast, it's not much of an option. So, and if we just give you an example, the Columbia River, there's just never quite enough water to go around. So the Columbia River is a big river, produces lots of water. Well, some people want that water for drinking, and some people want that water for agriculture, and some people want that water for fish, and some people want that water for generating hydroelectricity. And anything you do there sort of reduces the water available for the other choices. So there are people who want to, the Snake River flows through Idaho into Southeast Washington and collects with the Columbia. It has a bunch of dams on it. Everywhere you build dams, you lose salmon. And salmon are an important resource. So there's a big trade-off there. So you've got people who say, blow up those dams, and then people, of course, who are using that electricity and also the irrigation from that. They're like, no, 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 don't do that. That'll be an economic disaster. So those are tricky problems to solve. One thing that I noticed in my research that I talk about in that part of the chapter is that something like 40% of the world's water is lost through waste. Seriously, one of our biggest problems is basically leaky pipes and faucets. Now, someday you'll have a house and you'll have a water bill and your toilet will start running and it'll run all the time and your water bill will just go through the roof. So you kind of got to fix those things. You got a leaky faucet, you got a toilet that runs, you got to fix that because that adds up in a hurry, even though the leak may be very small. So that's a problem. And there's a potential solution. That's called a non-point source problem. And this is what makes these problems so difficult to solve. If it was just like one factory, you could fix that. But when it's millions of homes and businesses scattered around the world with leaky pipes, that's trickier. And I have kind of argued in this class, and maybe you've noticed this, is that that's where you need government. Government sort of has to step in and say, okay, you all have to fix this thing, because if you just leave it up to individuals, some will and some won't. It's like the guys in gym locker rooms who go and they take a shower and then they walk off and they just leave the shower running. And I remember one guy, because I never know when to shut up, this one guy says, it's not my water bill. And I said, yes, but it's everybody's water. And I went and turned the shower off. So anyway, because I'm a crabby old man. No questions? Nothing, nada? All right. Well, look, we're almost done. Got a couple exams, got a couple of discussion questions. Really think about your answers. Natalie, you can certainly ask something after class if you like, that's fine. Be careful with your answers. Think about them broadly. Let's not make the same mistakes we made with the intervention in the economy question. People just skipped 2/3 of the answers. So this week, the one that could trip you up, as I said, international liberalism. It's just not the same thing as classical liberalism. I mean, as usual, the people who most need to hear this are probably not here. That's all right. Maybe hopefully they'll watch the video. So, and you can watch the video over too, of course. So, all right. I got nothing else to tell you if you don't have questions. Here we go. Tariffs, do we put tariffs on everything that's imported? So that's an excellent question, Haley. The answer now is no. We used to. But after World War II, we created an international institution called GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, that has since been replaced by the World Trade Organization. And it's a collective cooperative way to sort of try to set terms for world trade. So there aren't tariffs on imported goods anymore. It's pretty rare. And the reason that we don't do that in large part is because, one, we've agreed not to, and two, like I said, if we reinstituted tariffs, all of our trading partners would do the same, and they might overreact. So at the outset of the Great Depression, the economy was tanking and people were losing jobs, and Congress and the president decided they would put tariffs on imports to try to preserve American jobs. And we did, and all of our trading partners retaliated. I mean, we used to lead the world in auto production, and we were selling lots of cars into Europe. And of course, well, once we put tariffs on imported European goods, the Europeans put tariffs on American cars, which was a great boost to the domestic car industry in Europe. I mean, we invented the damn things, right? So tariffs hurt trade. And, we put tariffs on things we don't even make, like pistachio nuts. I don't know if that was trying to help out peanut farmers or what, but I mean, it just didn't work. And in fact, it made the economy worse here. So we just don't do that anymore. My argument, and I'm not the first person to make this, is that a really, really low tariff would give us money. It wouldn't penalize efficient producers, wouldn't raise prices that much, but it would raise money that we could use to help people whose jobs are affected by trade. So does that make sense, Haley? Did I answer your question, or did I just babble pointlessly as usual? Okay, good. All right. You're very welcome. Anything else? I'll just wait here. If it's time for you to go, that's fine. Otherwise, if you have other questions, you can message me. You can get your mic to work. You can ask me out loud. But good to be with you again this week. I hope you understand. I beat up on you because you have potential, right? You can do great things. You're smart people. You're in the right place. There's a reason you're in college. You have it going on, but you got to apply yourself. You got to learn how to be a better student. It's just not high school. It's just not the same. There's a much higher degree of level of responsibility that's expected. And you have to be really brave enough to ask questions and ask for help. When a student asks me for help, I'm going to help them. But if you say nothing, I can't reach into your tiny little minds and go, change this. All right. Thank you, friends. Have a good rest of your week. Natalie, you got your mic to work.
I was like, so I was one of the people who messed up on that answer from last week's exam, and
you weren't alone.
My grade, yes, I know. I should have done the reading a little better, but now I have a 93 in the class, and
okay, all right. Let me address that. All right. Okay, go back and read the syllabus. All right. One, I don't grade that way. There's 500 points possible, and it doesn't matter how you get there. So the percentage you get on a particular exam is not terribly important, or your overall percentage of points is not terribly important. All right, that's one thing. Two, and everybody should take this to heart, you should really focus on learning. You should not focus on your grades. If you focus on your grades, students just never do as well, okay? If you focus on learning, one, you learn more, and two, you'll get the grade you want. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, losing, I don't, I'm guessing, right? Losing 5 points on one essay question is not greatly going to affect your grade. Now, if every exam was like that, then yeah, cumulatively that will have an impact. But remember, there's all that extra credit built in there. So just turn everything in, you'll do fine. That makes sense?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. You're going to do fine. All right. Anything else?
No, I just was.
Of
Of
course, you're concerned about. Of course, you're concerned about your grade, but really, the focus should always be learning, because that's going to get you the grade that you want. This class has not been bad about that, but I've certainly had students. We call them, and professors, we call them, and it's not you guys, okay? Grade grubbers, right? People are always, chewing and biting and scratching and clawing, for that extra point for something. Or students, can I get extra credit for that? It's like, really? So, and those students rarely get the grade that they want because they're not focused on the right thing. Anyway, what else? What else can I tell you? Any questions? Yeah.
So I hope you have a good week.
Thanks. You
Dog
too.
yourself.
Yeah. All right. Take care. Be safe out there.
Take care.
Thank you.
I will. Thank you.
Christina, Amina, Jayla, Sydney, anything for you guys? You're still here?
Yeah. I know you were just talking about grades, and this is probably a dumb question, but
there are no dumb questions.
Oh, okay. So if I have an 81% in your class, do you think it would be do you think by the end of the quarter if I like do everything right, I could get that up to like a 90%.
Okay, let me repeat what I just said about how I grade. It's not
Yeah.
based on a percentage. So if you got 81 or 90, I don't know what that means. It's your total points. And if you look at the syllabus, which nobody ever does, I'm sorry, they just don't. And that's always the first thing you should read in a class. Read the syllabus. The professor tells you, here's how I'm going to do stuff. The syllabus says, if I recall correctly, you get 500 points, you get a very good grade. And it doesn't matter how you get there. So whether you got 70 or 80 or 90% on a particular assignment, it doesn't matter. It's the cumulative points.
Okay.
That makes sense? So look at how many points you have, then go look at the syllabus and you'll see where you're at and what you're in range of.
Oh, okay. I got you. That makes a lot of sense. Okay.
Okay, good. All right, I'm glad. This makes me happy. All right. Christina, anything for you? All right, friends, I'm going to sign off then. I hope you both have a good rest of your day. If you have any questions, you know where to find me.
Okay. Goodbye.
Bye.